In the previous episode, we witnessed some of the greatest halachic figures waging war against Machnisei Rachamim and a number of other piyutim. In part 2, today, we will hear the voices of the supporters. Most importantly, we will speculate as to why the Tzemach Tzedek eventually abandoned his earlier opposition against Machnisei Rachamim, and also why he ignored one of the primary sources on the subject, a short but powerful tshuva from Rabbi Yisrael of Blue.
Machnisei Rachamim, Machnisei Rachamim, Lifnei Bal Rachamim, Mashmiei Tefillah, Hashmiei Tefillah Seinu.
Last week, we looked at all of the problems with Machnisei Rachamim. And this morning, the third day of Slichus, if you were paying attention, we had the piyut, Machnisei Rachamim. That too is a controversial piyut. And we noticed the problems with it last week. In summary, very much bekitzer, if you take things in a very black and white perspective, we speak to God only, we pray to God only, we worship God only. And if you look at the language of the Rambam and the Talmud Yerushalmi, the idea that you ask an angel to do this prayer on your behalf seems to be off the table. Mela, as we spoke last week, Mela, another human being, even a human being who passed away, that we know is acceptable. But an angel, that seemed to be, at least from the Yerushalmi, where he was clearly negating it. And the Rambam as well, he says that one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim is that you shouldn't worship the Malachim to get closer to God. Well, when you bring a prayer to a Malach, asking the Malach to bring it closer to the Eibishter, that seems to violate the Rambam's principle. And so we saw all of the problems, and we saw how the Tzemach Tzedek himself, in Derech Mitzvah, which was written in his youth, I think we said it was Tov Kuf Samach Vav, so that would be 1806 on Erech, when he wrote this, he said that we shouldn't say these piyutim. More are coming up. Erev Rosh Hashanah, there's going to be 2 of them in the Slichis, and then we have Yom Kippur, another one. And all of this we saw last week. What are we going to do today? Today, we're going to look at the other side of the coin. And we're going to begin on the handout on page 5. Because we're going to start seeing how already from the time of the Rishonim, there were Gdolei Yisrael who said, not so fast. So, as follows. We're going to begin like this. There is a certain work, a very short work, a few pages long, that was printed for the first time a few years ago. What happened was that, you have books in libraries around the world, and in a few of these books, there's a tshuva about Machnisei Rachamim, and one of them says that it was written by Rabbi Elazar of Worms. Now, the reason that's important is because Rabbi Elazar of Worms is a very important Rishon. He passed away around the year 1240, very influential and very important in Ashkenaz. So, one of the manuscripts that has this tshuva says that it was written by him. So, if that's correct, then we could date the tshuva, we could date it to the, sometime to the beginning, the first half of the 13th century. And let's see what he writes. So, the intro, well, just to get a little bit of flavor from the intro, it says as follows. Zois tainas Baal Hadin. This summarizes the taina of the person who made the case. In other words, it was someone who got up somewhere, somehow. Maybe he got up in shul, maybe he wrote a pamphlet, but he basically made a macha against reciting Machnisei Rachamim for all of the reasons that we saw in the previous class. And Rabbi Elazar of Worms summarizes what this person's arguments were. Now he writes, I look up to the hills, I hear a voice speaking to me. What does this voice say? Ki oyru einecha. Your eyes have been illuminated. Ki ta'amta tam davash. Because you have tasted honey. In other words, he hears a voice that's saying, you're enlightened. You have tasted honey. You can't learn. You have experience with polemics. You know the sugyas well. So va'ata, now, chazek va'anei, gather courage, gather strength, and give an answer. Al tira, don't be afraid. In other words, this was This was a serious polemic that was going on at the time, and I heard this voice saying it, and therefore va'an va'omer, and here is what my tshuva is going to be, and this is his prelude that he gives before he goes on to give his arguments. We'll see his arguments in a second, but before we do that, I just want to say, in this poetic language, he hears voices. He looks up to the mountain and he hears a mouth speaking to him. What does that mean? So either it's poetic, means he thought to himself, that's what it means. Or maybe it is, he had some sort of vision, maybe he did. We know some of the Rishonim, Rebbe Lazar of Worms, it would fit the profile that he had a certain type of vision, whether it was a dream or bahakit. So it could be one or the other. Now, the tshuva goes on for a number of paragraphs. Most of it, he quotes dozens and dozens of sources from Chazal. Midrashim, Bavli, Yerushalmi, many different sources from Chazal. Most of them are doing the following three things. Number one, they're bringing rayas that we turn to another human being to ask another person to daven for us. That's number one. Many rayas from Chazal that this is something that we do. A second category of evidence he brings is where we turn to human beings who've already passed away and we ask them to daven for us. A third thing he does is he cites many Mamarei Chazal that show the Malachim in the role of bringing our tefillas to the Eibishter. He takes these three things and he says, if you look at these three things, then what's the big deal of turning to a Malach and asking to bring the prayer to God? To a human being, you're allowed to ask him to bring the prayer to God. To a human being who's passed, you're allowed to. A Malach we see does that job. So Marash, what's the big deal? Go ahead and do this. Now, the truth is, this itself doesn't really counter the points that we discussed last week. Why? Because the points we discussed last week was, I know the Malach does the job. Who gives you the right to talk to him? I know that we have the right to ask another human being living or passed away, or who passed away to daven for us, because they're much less prone to make a mistake, that they have power. Hashem and Malach, much more prone. We saw the Rishoner, Rabbi Yehuda bar Yakar, and the Mabit who made that distinction. So really, all of those Mamarei Chazal don't really cross the line in terms of bringing evidence. However, there are a few passages of Mamarei Chazal that are stronger rayas, and that's what's going to be our focus right now. So let's look at number 18, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Daf Yuzayin, Amid Aleph. Rebbe Lazar of Worms cites this Gemara. Here you have the story of Rebbe Lazar ben Dordaya. Rebbe Lazar ben Dordaya, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah tells us, was a person who committed many averos, and then he had a moment where he decided he wants to do tshuva. And he realizes, someone tells him, you're never going to be able to do tshuva. Omar, so he says, Harim ugvois, bikshu alai rachamim. He turns to the hills and he asks the mountains that the mountains should daven for him. Now, what does this mean, that the mountains should daven for him? Hold the thought for a second. Amru loi, the mountain said back, Ad shanu mavakshim alecha, before we daven for you, nevakesh al atzmeinu. Let us daven for ourselves. How do you have a conversation with a mountain? So Tosfos al-Asar discusses this, and Tosfos says that we know the concept of the Sar, just like we see Soroi shel Esav. Esav is Lamata, and then there's the Sar of Esav Lamaila. So too, you could have mountains Lamata, and there's the Sar of the mountains. In other words, the Malachim Lamaila, that they have jurisdiction over mountains. So the conversation, Tosfos says, in one of his two biurim, is the conversation was happening with the Malach of the mountains. Okay. Let's continue. Omar, Shamayim va'aretz bikshu alai rachamim. Now he turns to heaven and earth, and they say the same thing. We're not going to daven for you. Omar, he said, Chamu ulavana bikshu alai rachamim, sun and the moon. Tosfos again would say, this is the Sar of the sun, the Sar of the moon. They say, we're not going to daven. The stars and the planets, bikshu alai rachamim. And they also said they can't do it. Omar, so Elazar ben Dodaya said, Ein hadavar toloi elabi. You know something? No one is going to be able to daven for me. I have to do this by myself. So he put his head between his knees. And he cried until he died. A baska, a heavenly voice, emerged from heaven and said, Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya, Mizuman, L'chaya Olam Haba, is going to go to Olam Haba. Says Rabbi Elazar of Worms, he's going to Olam Haba. Send him straight to hell. Why? He asked the Sarim of the mountains and the sun and the stars and all those things to daven for him. And if all of those people are right, that you're not allowed to do that, so then why is he a good guy? The Gemara reports it and doesn't even condemn it. And in fact, he sent to Olam Haba. Now, Is it possible to respond to this raya? Of course it's possible to respond to this raya. L'mashal, some Mefarshim say that he's talking to mountains. He doesn't mean literal mountains. He's talking to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. L'mashal. Okay, especially when it comes to an agadata, I don't think you're ever going to walk away and say that agada is definitive proof. But that's not our purpose here. Our purpose here is to understand right now what Rebbe Lazar of Worms was saying, and then after we hear all the evidence to see, is there a case? So what is his first point? His first point here is that we have a Gemara in Avodah Zarah that presents Rebbe Lazar ben Dodaya, according to Tosfos, asking the angels of a whole bunch of different entities to bring his prayer before Hashem, and they refused to do so. But the fact is that he asked is that raya has to be kosher. What's interesting is there's a medrash that is awfully similar to this Gemara in Avodah Zarah. The medrash in Tanchuma, there's a medrash Tanchuma that presents Moshe Rabbeinu trying to get into Eretz Yisrael, and Eibishter tells him no. So he does the same thing, and it almost follows line by line this Gemara. He turns to the Harim and Gvois, and he asks them, you plead for me to get me into Eretz Yisrael. They say no. He turns to the Shemaim V'aretz. They say no. He turns to the Chama of Hana. They say no. According to Tosfos, the right way to understand this again is that Moshe Rabbeinu is turning to the Malachim. Now the Raya is even bigger. Moshe Rabbeinu is doing this thing. In fact, that medrash goes further because after all of these entities deny him, the lashon of the medrash is that he was Machnisei Rachamim from the Sar HaPnim. Sar HaPnim is a lashon referring to a specific malach, obviously one that's high up in the chain of command. And Moshe Rabbeinu turned to him and asked the Sar HaPnim, and he too said no. So this medrash as well, you could put it together with the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. This is one piece of evidence that Rebbe Lazar of Worms was saying no to the person who was denying the right to recite Machnisei Rachamim. Again, this is just one piece. Then he brings another piece. You have a Gemara in Sanhedrin. This Gemara in Sanhedrin is actually not Agada, L'choira. It's L'choira more halacha. Let's see what it says. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, this is Sanhedrin Daf Mem Daled Amid Beis. Rabbi Yochanan says, La'elam yavakesh adam rachamim sheyu hakol ma'amsin es koichei. A person should always daven that everyone should strengthen him, strengthen his power, va'al yehu loitzarim omayla, and there shouldn't be people getting in the way above. It's an interesting line. What does this mean? Rabbi Yochanan is saying that we should daven, that everyone should help us, and we shouldn't get in the way. Zok Rashi, right there, Rashi says, the davening is sheyisayuhu malachei hashares. You're davening that the malachei hashares should help you, levakesh rachamim, to plead on your behalf, v'shalo yu loy mastinim omayla, and that there shouldn't be any malachim that get in the way above. How is Rebbe Lazar of Worms understanding this Gemara and this Rashi? Rebbe Lazar of Worms is understanding this Gemara and Rashi is saying that in addition to doing the regular davening that we need to do to God, on top of that, Rabbi Yochanan told us that in addition to that, we should speak to the malachim, and we should ask them, and we should tell them, please help my prayer out, and make sure no one gets in the way. Then you have a Gemara, a clear Gemara that's telling you should say Machnisei Rachamim. Of course, not to the exclusion of regular davening, but let's remember, these piyutim are never to the exclusion of regular davening. They're always complementing regular davening. So here you have a stronger raya. Rabbi Yochanan said, La'olam, this is what a person should be doing. In fact, the question would be, in a regular day of Shachris, we don't do it. How you talking? Okay, we're not going to address that. But the point is, Rebbe Lazar of Worms brings this as a second raya. Is this a definitive raya? It's not a definitive raya. Why? Because the Maharal, as we know from last class, was against Machnisei Rachamim. He said that he thinks this is a problem. In fact, if you remember, he edited the liturgy to say, instead of talking to the Malachim, you're actually talking to God about the Malachim. The Maharal brings his Gemara, and he says, this is not a raya that you're allowed to do this. Why? Because the prayer here is to God. The prayer Rabbi Yochanan said is that we need to do a regular tefillah to Hashem that says, please be marapa v'choila. Then we need to say, by the way, Eibishter, please make sure that the malachim help out and the malachim don't get in the way. You can't prove one way or the other from the text. Read the text of the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, La'olam yavakesh adam rachamim, from whom? From God or from the angels? Sheyu hakol ma'amsin as koicha, that all the angels should help out. The Gemara is vague enough to allow for both interpretations. Reb Lazar of Worms brings this interpretation, the way in a supporting way, to show that Machnisei Rachamim is 100% kosher. He was not the only one who did this. In fact, there's a Shibbolei Aleket. Shibbolei Aleket is from the same generation, the same era, from the 1200s. This is produced in Italy by Reb Tzidkiya HaRoifa, and it's a little later. He's a few decades after Rebbe Elazar of Worms. He also says, "Oh, Machnisei Rachamim, there are people who are saying it's problematic. It's not problematic because of this Gemara in Sanhedrin." But let's go back to Rebbe Elazar of Worms, because now we'll see another Gemara that he brings, and this one is a shtickle stronger raya. Let's see. Now, let's go to the Gemara in Brachas Daf Samach Amud Beis. Here is going to be the last raya that we're going to look at from Rebbe Elazar of Worms. The Gemara says as follows. Hanichnas lebeis hakisei, when a person uses the restroom, oimer, he should say as follows. Hiskabdu michubadim kedoshim misharsei elyon. We're talking here to misharsei elyon, kedoshim michubadim. 3 terms for malachim. The ones who service the Eibishter, they're holy, they're honored, and we tell them, hiskabdu, be honored. Be honored, we telling these malachim. Tznu kaveh le'elokei Yisrael, give honor to Hashem. Harpu or hirpu mimeni, leave me, while I'm going into the restroom, I should go in, and I'll do what I need to do, and then I'll come back. In other words, before you're walking into the restroom, the malachim are not coming with you. They're not coming with you. You don't just leave abruptly. You don't want to do an Irish goodbye. So what you do is you go over to them and you say, by the way, I'm checking in here for a minute, and this is the lashon that the Gemara says one should say. Amar Abaye. Fine. Here, as of now, there's no prayer to malachim. We didn't ask the malachim to do anything for us. We just said, wait up for me. Amar Abaye, but then comes along Abaye and says, Lo leima inish hachi. A person should not say what was just mentioned above. Why? Dilma shafki leva ozli. Maybe the angels will leave you. Why? Chveisnish. But Abaye says that if you say what was just said, the angels may leave you. You come back out, they're not going to be there. Elo lema. So this is what you should say. Tell the malachim, Shamruni, Shamruni, guard me. Azaruni, Azaruni, help me. Samchuni, Samchuni, support me. Hamtinuli, Hamtinuli, wait for me. Ache, Kanes, Eitze, until I go in and out. Shekain, Darkan, Shopanei Adam, don't make fun of me that I need to do this. This is what human beings need to do. This is the way of the world, and this is what Abaye says a person should be saying. Lahalacha, all of the major poskim, Rif, Rosh, and even the Rambam. Even the Rambam brings that you say both. A merger of both pieces. Both what the Gemara originally said and what Abaye said, which has those key words where we turn to the angel and say, guard me, support me, help me, and help me. Says Rebbe Elazar of Worms, don't you see over here that it's okay to turn to an angel and ask them for something? You're telling me Machnisei Rachamim is a problem. Here you see more, you even turning to the angel and saying, give me bracha, give me good things. So this is a little bit of a stronger raya that Rebbe Elazar of Worms says. Now, derech hagav, we do not say this today. Why don't we say this today? So the Alter Rebbe brings in Shulchan Aruch from earlier poskim that it's a little bit, we don't assume that we have, this is the lashon, we don't assume that we're special enough that we have angels with us as we're entering the restroom. And so therefore, we're not going to say this because we don't make the assumption. Interestingly, there's a ksav that was discovered recently from the Rebbe Rashab. I don't believe it was ever published yet in an official way, where the Rebbe Rashab quotes this din in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. We don't assume we have angels with us, so we don't say this to them before we go into the restroom. So the Rebbe Rashab says, so why do we say Shalom Aleichem? Shalom Aleichem assumes that angels came home from shul together with you on Friday night. If we don't assume angels are with us, so why are we saying Shalom Aleichem? The Rebbe Rashab adds, after Shabbos shiny, maybe Shabbos is different. In other words, the regular weekday angels aren't with us, but Shabbos angels, the special ones that come to give a bracha on the home, maybe that's different. Okay, that's an interesting thing. But what's the bottom line? The bottom line is, we've seen over here 3 pieces of evidence. 3 pieces of evidence, and now is the third one, where even the Rambam allowed for a conversation with the malachim, where we're turning to them and we're saying, guide them. This is a summary of the 3 points that Rebbe Elazar of Worms was saying, proves Machnisei Rachamim is completely kosher. There's one more piece from Rebbe Elazar of Worms that we need to address. And that is, he knows you have the Yerushalmi. Let's say he knows the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi means a lot to him. And there it says, don't yell out to Michal, don't yell out Gavriel, speak to me directly. What he basically does is, he's going to show that there's a Gemara that says Jews don't need a shliach, a Bavli that says Jews don't need a shliach. But he's also going to make an argument that if you look at the context of that Gemara well, it's talking about a certain time. It's talking about a certain era. And his argument is going to be that era is Zman HaBayis. And when you come to Zman HaGolos, that is no longer true. In other words, the Yerushalmi is only talking about at a time of Gilui Elikus. There's a time when the relationship between the Jewish people and Am Yisrael is in a perfect place. And so therefore, there's, so to speak, open lines of communication, no problem. That's where you have the Yerushalmi. But when we're in Galos, this is not the case. Where does he show you this? He shows you this from the Gemara in Yuma Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph. The context is talking about how the Avodah was done in the Beis HaMikdash, which does not need to concern us, other than to know that it's talking about the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. And Rabbi Yossi says the reason it was done in a specific way is because Chavivin, Yisrael, Yidden are precious. Shalai Yitzrich and HaKasav L'Shliach, Torah says they don't need any intermediary between them and God. And Rashi explains, Ella, rather, Kol Echad V'Echad Mispalal Al Atzmai. Everyone davens for himself. Shenamar, where do you see that? Because Shlomo HaMelech, when he dedicated the first Beis HaMikdash, he said, Asher Yedun Ish Negalavava, each person knows what's bothering him. Ufaras Kapav Alabai says, hey, he's going to come to this home, to the Beis HaMikdash, and he's going to daven. What do you see? Each person is davening for himself. Says Rabbi Lazar of Worms, two things. Number one, what's the context? Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. Number two, the pasuk from Shlomo HaMelech is talking about what? The existence of the Beis HaMikdash. Says Rabbi Lazar Ekech, Bizman habayis ha'yisrael chavivim lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There we were precious in God's eyes. Lo ha'yitzrichin l'shliach, we didn't need a shliach. Mishacharav, once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, nasu ka'avodim, now we're like servants who taka can't get into the palace. V'tzrichin l'shliach meilitz chaviv lefnei ha'makam, and so we need an intermediary to daven to us for before Hashem. Rabbi Lazar of Worms seems here to be directly responding to the Yerushalmi, which said, you don't need a meilit, and here we're saying, yes, true for a certain time and place, not true for today. And this becomes the first of four explanations of, okay, we prove from the Gemara, for Rabbi Lazar Arkeich's perspective, you prove from the Gemara that this is okay. But how does it not contravene the Yerushalmi? How does it not contravene the Yerushalmi? Even if you brought me 10 rayas from the Gemara that says it's okay, how does it not contravene the Yerushalmi? So he brought us 3 rayas. Now he's telling you want to know why it doesn't contradict the Yerushalmi? It doesn't contradict the Yerushalmi because the Yerushalmi is not talking about Bisman HaGolos. When we're Bisman HaGolos, it is totally okay. This is going to be the first of 4 explanations that we're going to give to say why is this activity not a contradiction to what we have from the Yerushalmi. Explanation number 2. With that, we finish with Rabbi Lazar Rekeach, and we go back to Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yakar. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yakar was one of the people, he was the Rebbe of the Ramban, and he wrote against Machnisei Rachamim. We saw he was upset about Machnisei Rachamim, and he too suggested that we should change not the text, but we should change the meaning of the piyut, right? He said that it's referring not to Malachim, it's referring to Tzadikim, right? So look what he says over here. He comes back to the issue another time, and he says the following. You know what? I'll give an explanation for why this is mutter. He says this is why we say Machnisei Rachamim always toward the end of davening, or in our case, the end of slichus. Likewise, when a person goes to a gravesite, he should daven first to God, and only afterwards he should ask of the dead people, then you tell the dead people, pray on my behalf for the matters that I already prayed about. In other words, what's important for Rabbi Yehuda Bar Yakar? What's important for Yehuda Bar Yakar is that first the person davens to Hashem. And after the person davens to Hashem, then he adds on a second thing. That add-on is turning to either the people who have passed away in the cemetery or to the Malachim and asking them to help out with your prayer. That is okay, he says. Which is why Machnisei Rachamim is always at the end. You're not allowed to open your prayer by saying to Malachim, Bakshu aleinu rachamim al davar zeh, request a prayer in my behalf. If you didn't daven to Hashem first. And that is what the Yerushalmi and Brachas means. So in other words, we have here a second explanation. Why is Yerushalmi and Brachas not a contradiction to Machnisei Rachamim? Yerushalmi and Brachas said, don't yell out to Michal, don't yell out to Gabriel, speak to me. That's true. Speak to me, don't yell out to Michal and Gabriel. But after you speak to me, you went into the palace, you spoke to the king, you're on your way out. When you're on your way out, after you already had your private audience with the king, because you have no problem getting in, you saw Michal and Gabriel, on the way out you can say, by the way, put in a good word for me. That is okay, and in that way, it's not a stira to the Yerushalmi. So, explanation one, why is it not a stira to Yerushalmi, is because Yerushalmi is only talking about Zman HaBayis. Explanation two, it's not a stira to Yerushalmi because Yerushalmi is only talking about if it's your exclusive prayer, whereas if it's you're in the palace on the way out, you're allowed to turn to the Malachim. Now we have the Maharal. Let's go back to the Maharal. The Maharal is going to give us a third justification, possible justification for these types of prayers. Remember, the Maharal is against these prayers. And he even suggested amending it. But he too, like Rabbi Yehuda bar Yakar, as much as they suggested to change something about the tefillah, they knew everyone's saying it and no one's buying their change. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda bar Yakar said, okay, let's come up with a justification, which he did. But he himself, by the way, at the end of his justification says, I'd prefer if we didn't do this at all. And Maharal does something similar. Maharal, you already know, says, let's change the text of the prayer. But he also knows it's not so practical that's going to happen. And so he says as follows, I'll come up with a justification. V'yesh loymar, we can suggest, Ki ma she'anu oimrim, Machnisei Rachamim, hachnisu v'chulu, ein zeh bakasha klal. We're not asking other malachim anything. Rather, we're commanding the malachim who have this job to do their job. A human being could command malachim who are already appointed to bring the prayer to the Eibishter. What's the distinction here? There's a difference between asking, pleading on the one hand, or commanding. If you're asking or pleading, then what's the hierarchy? They're higher than you. Anytime you're asking from someone, then by definition, at least in that area, that person has something you don't have, and you're asking for that person. That positions the Jew below the malach, which means that the malach is between the Yid and the Eibishter. But if you're commanding the malach, you tell the malach, by the way, do this. So now it's like you're in charge of the malach. It's like you're close with the Eibishter, and you're commanding the malach. Imagine you have the king, and he has another king comes from another country, and they're sitting next to each other. So the other guy tells one of the king's servants, bring me a glass of water. Nothing wrong with that. Why? Because you're having yechidus with the king one-on-one, and you ask the low underling to go and do something for you. This is what the Maharal says. So it's not a bakasha, it's a command. He still says, I prefer if we don't say it. Very similar to Rabbi Yehuda bar Yakar. I prefer if we don't say it. But if we're saying it, this is the way for it to make sense. And then it's not a stiddah with the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says, don't plead to Michal and Gavriel in a way of where you're asking them. But to command them, not a problem. So this is a third approach. Interestingly, one sec. Interestingly, the Sfarnoi on Hamalach HaGoyel, last week we spoke about Hamalach HaGoyel. And then we raised the question, how is Hamalach HaGoyel, oisi, considered kosher and acceptable? What was the answer? The answer that we saw last week was because you're asking the Eibishter that he should bench you. That was what we saw. Fine. The Sforno is a different approach. He says that Yaakov Avinu is commanding the Malachim. That it's Siva, we're commanding the Malachim. That's how Sforno understands Hamalach HaGoyel. So Sforno's explanation seems to be very similar to what Maharal is doing. Okay, so now we come to the more difficult passage in this whole sugya. That's the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek has a passage in Eira Torah. Remember, Derech Mitzvah Sacha, written when he was younger, he said we should cancel these prayers. We shouldn't be saying them. Well, this is from later in life. This mimer in Eira Torah actually has a date. It was said in 1830, Tov Kuf Tzadik. So this is already when the Tzemach Tzedek was Rebbe. And in this passage, he says as follows. Let's read it closely. Hamalachim ma'alim hatfilos. The malachim bring our tfilos to the Eibishter. Lefi shebedibur adam hu gashmius. Because human speech is physical. Va'yedei hamalach hamakabel hatfilah. And when the angel accepts the tfilah, mizdacheches hatfilah megashmius l'ruchnius, it's transformed. The currency changes from physical to spiritual. In other words, there's a different perspective over here on what does it mean the malach brings your tefillah to the Eibishter. It's not pshat that the Eibishter, so to speak, doesn't hear. The Eibishter heard, he knows what you need. But there's something about davening that it's like supposed to, the energy, the words, they're supposed to be stored away on high. Whatever that means, I'll pick up all on Sidis. And for that to happen, it needs to go through the malachim because they make the birur, they make the cleaning of the words that we recite, that they should go on high. Accordingly, we could say, Pirush Masha Emrim B'Slichas LaMalachim. when we talk to the malachim and we say, Machnisei Rachamim, Machnisei Tfilaseinu, V'hikshu al, and everyone asks, Shanira Kilo Meisim and Soin Chas V'Shalom Bein Ela Kadosh Baruch Hu. It looks like we're putting intermediaries between us and Hashem. V'zeh Yisro Gomer, which is forbidden. And I myself cited this. He doesn't say this, but I'm adding. I myself cited this in Derech Mitzvah Secha, and I said that therefore we shouldn't say these tefillas. You know what? It's not a problem. Why is it not a problem? We're not asking of them anything. Rak, the only thing we are asking them is to be a shliach. Number one, to bring the hashpah from the Eibishter from above down to us, which is what the concept of, he doesn't say this, but Barchuni l'shalem, bring the hashpah. You have a job of sending the Eibishter's brachas on hashpah down to us. Barchuni l'shalem, bring your hashpah down. V'chein, they have a second job. Hey, mailin atfilos, they bring our tefillas up. And here it says, Kidisa Gemara, you have a Gemara, uvizoyar parsha shmois, that they bring our tefillas up. Lachein oimrim, therefore we say, hachnisu tfilaseinu, bring our tefillas before the Eibishter. The Hainu, this refers, Shem Mailim Oisis Hadibur Shalanu, that they bring our words, Lios Mistacheches Hatfila, so that the prayer becomes refined and is able to go up Lamaila. This is what the Tzemach Tzedek says, an about face from what we have in Derech Mitzvah Secha. Here he says, no problem. But why? Why is it no problem? So what's his word? His word is, I'm not asking the Malach anything. We knew that all the time. We knew all the time we're not turning to the Malach and saying, by the way, Malach, provide for me ketchup. We never said that. What we said was, take my tefillah and bring it to the Eibishter. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, you want to know it's okay? Because it's only that. But the Rambam told us we shouldn't be serving the Malach to get us closer to the Eibishter. The Karban Hasano said that this is a problem. These prayers are a problem. Knowing that we weren't turning to them as the authority, knowing that we're only turning to them as those who bring the Ashpah. So it seems there is no new information that the Tzemach Tzedek is putting into the system to come to a different conclusion. It's all the same information, but just saying, I don't think it's a problem. So what's going on over here? What's happening here? So let me explain myself. So what's happening over here? So I think the simplest way of understanding it is, in Derech Mitzvah Secha, there was an assumption that you're not allowed to do something. Now the Tzemach Tzedek is saying that assumption is incorrect. You are, the thing we said earlier, you're not allowed to do, you are allowed to do it. Where was the mucker that said you're not allowed to do it? So you have the Mekoides, okay, so you have to get into a conversation how to make it fit with the Mekoides. But the Yerushalmi or the Rambam, but there's just as many Mekoides that now we saw with Rabbi Lazar Rekeach, Rabbi Lazar, the author of the Rekeach, just as many Mekoides who are saying that it's okay. So in other words, the point is, yeah, the thing that I thought was asa before, I'm saying that it's mutter now. But what drove that change? So I want to suggest two possibilities of what may have caused this change. I want to show you the Yavitz. Let's look at the Yavitz. The Yavitz is obviously living before the Tzemach Tzedek. He passed away in 1776. And his Svarim were printed during his lifetime, including Moiru Ksiya, which is the work that we're going to quote from, was printed during his lifetime. These were widely available Svarim. And it sounds reasonable that the Tzemach Tzedek would have seen something like this. Let's look at what the Yavitz says about this. He picks up on the Gemara that said we ask the angels to protect us when we're going into the restroom. Frek the Yavitz. How is this possible? How could you say help me? How could you say guard me? It says, you're not allowed to yell out to Michal and Gabriel. Why? Makes sense. Malachim can't help you. As it says, the angels are Hashem commands the angels. That's what the pshat of the pasuk is. The Eibishter commands the angels to guard you. So they have no koyach. If they have no koyach, that's why the Yerushalmi says, don't turn to them in prayer. So frek the Yavitz, hayatachim we're saying, Shamruni Azruni. By the way, interesting, our minig, after we say Shalom Aleichem, is to say two psukim. What do we say? Ki malacha v'yitzav alach l'shmarcha b'chol drachecha. This pasuk, Hashem yishmar tzeis choveyacha me'atav adolam. Why do we say those two psukim? So it's interesting. I looked in Svarim to see, and there's various explanations that are given, and I haven't seen the following explanation in Svarim, but it makes a lot of sense. You just finished saying Shalom Aleichem. Clarify what's going on over here. yes, Shalom Aleichem, yes, Barchuni L'Shalom, but ultimately, let's remind ourselves that Ki Malacha V'Yitzav Alach L'Shmarcha B'Chol Dechecha, that it's God who commands the Malachim to do their job, and ultimately, who is L'Shmarcha B'Chol Dechecha? Hashem Yishmar Tzeiso V'Yacha. The same Shmirah that you said is coming through the Malach is ultimately in Hashem's hands. But I didn't see that in Psukim they're saying this. Ad Kan, the parenthesis. Back to the Yavitz. The Yavitz asks, how is it mutter for us to say Shamruni Azruni if the Yerushalmi tells us not to? Nirli Ata Yashev. I'd like to suggest the answer, he says. Kivin she'omer meshar seyel yoin. Because in these piyutim, it happens to be the one we recited this morning, has the word mishar seyel yoin. But as well, the one in the Gemara outside the bathroom also has the words mishar seyel yoin. Keloimar, which means we're indicating in the text that they are messengers from God. So therefore, who chose in his free will that how is he going to do hashgacha pratis through the malachim? So therefore, when you say the words mishar se'elyain, he's showing that the greatness and the hashgacha is all God's. If in your plea to the malachim you recognize God as the boss, then it's totally fine. This is what he says. In other words, we were saying there's a problem. The Yerushalmi's problem is limited to someone who yells to Michal, yells to Gavriel, thinking that I need to get something from you. That's a problem. But yelling to Michal and Gavriel, and knowing that they are servants of the Eibishter, asking them to do their job, the Yavit says, I don't have a problem with it. At the end of the day, this is their job. This is what they do. As it says in many places. In addition, in addition to bringing our prayers to God, they also are the shluchim that execute God's hashgacha pratis. Everything that's needed for man. Which we see this in many different psukim. And so therefore, they have the job, they're anyway doing it, you're recognizing God as the boss, guess what? Nothing wrong to ask them to do their job. Nothing wrong to ask them to do their job, which is one of two things. Do their job and protect me, guard me, give me the bracha that Hashem said you need to give to me, and do your job of bringing my tefillah, of bringing my prayer to the Eibishter. So, if this means that the Yavitz is disagreeing with the Rambam's prat in his 13 principles where he says you're not allowed to worship a malach to get you closer to God. If Rambam intended to say that you're not allowed to ask a malach to bring your prayer to Hashem, then Yavitz would say, with that prat we disagree with. So the 13 principles, we all agree with the 13 principles, but not with that one line of the Yud Gimel Ikrim. If that's what the Rambam mean, and I can't say we know for sure 100% what the Rambam meant, but definitely many people said that that's what the Rambam meant. The Tzemach Tzedek himself in Derech Mitzvah Secha said that's what the Rambam meant. If it is true that that's what the Rambam meant, then we turn to the Rambam, the Yavit says, and we say, sorry, this is not something that we pass like. I'd like to suggest that the Tzemach Tzedek is saying what the Yavit is saying. Why? There's so much, and maybe even to suggest that there was a shtickle influence that he said. Why? Because there's so much parallel between the text of the Tzemach Tzedek and the text of the Yavitz. Both of them are talking about the fact that there's a dual role for the Malach. The Malach brings the tefillahs up, and there are shluchim to bring the hashgacha down. And the Yavitz use that language that many times in Shas we see this is their job. The Tzemach Tzedek Mamish has parallel language and sentences that match up. I'm not saying it's the same atheists, but it's the same ideas. So maybe we could suggest that when he was younger, the Tzemach Tzedek only saw the Karban Asana, and he only saw Poskim who said no. So the Tzemach Tzedek followed that. Later, when the Tzemach Tzedek saw that some of the Gdolei Ador, including the Yavitz, and by the way, there are others, who lived before the Tzemach Tzedek, who said it was okay. So therefore, that same thing that he said was not okay, he changed to say that it is okay. This, I think, is the best way of understanding what's happening here. There is another perspective that is possible, and that is a little bit of a historical interpretation. And that is openness in the early 1800s to say, let's change the tefillah. Maybe there was less of an appetite for that a little later. Why am I saying that? Because in 1818, we spoke about this in a previous class, in 1818 was a big year for the reform movement. That was the year that the man named Eliezer Lieberman put out a book in Germany that was called Ur Neuga. And this is a book that is an argument for reform in many different areas in Yiddishkeit, written in Lashon HaKodesh, and he has scholarly sources and Mara Makoimis, and it's a big argument, a big polemic for reform. And a lot of it has to do with the shul and with davening and with all of that. And one of the things he does over there, he says, "And what's the big deal? What's the big deal with changing nusach? In fact, look, there's some problems in the piyutim. He says this. Machnisei Rachamim is a problem, and other Gdolei Adar came and said we shouldn't be saying it, and so therefore we can continue the job and continue doing this type of work, and we should cut out more piyutim." This is one of the things that he was doing. When is this? 1818. That happens to be, so I don't know. I don't know enough about the Tzemach Tzedek and his involvement and what was going on. This is in Germany, the Tzemach Tzedek's in Russia. But by 1830, does the appetite to say that we should start going into the Siddur and lifting that hood and start moving things around, maybe that appetite goes down. So this is another thing to speculate in this whole area. Another thing, interesting, last class we spoke about, that the Yavitz objected to Shalom Aleichem. He didn't understand. Why does the text say, Shalom Aleichem, Malach Yasharos Malach, Mi Melech Malach? What's the Mi Melech? Think about it. Say Shalom Aleichem. Who are these? Who are you saying Shalom Aleichem? To Malachei Asharis. Who are Malachei Elyon? And that's the who's the Elyon? Melech Malachei Malach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why again the stress? Me, from? Well, maybe now we have an answer. Because maybe if the Yavitz himself said that the Yesod of the Heter is a strong recognition that you're not an entity for yourself, that you are a shliach of the Eibishter. Good, so why not stress it again in the song? Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharis. Okay, Malachei Asharis says stresses in it once. Malachei Elyon, you stress it again. Me, Melech, from, you're stressing it another, hold on a second, you're stressing it another time. So maybe this is a possibility to address that in it. Now, one other thing. This is a change that we're talking about for the Tzemach Tzedek for Machnisei Rachamim, or for the Piyut Eskra, that is Midas HaRachamim. Where in the early 1800s, he said no. In 1830, he said absolutely yes. What about Shalom Aleichem? I showed you last week, Eidos, the son of the Tzemach Tzedek, Reb Chaim Shneur Zalman, that the Tzemach Tzedek didn't say Shalom Aleichem. It is very possible that here too there was a change. Why was there a change? Because there's a Maimer in Eira Torah, Parshas Vayetze, where the Dibur HaMaschal, this Maimer from the Tzemach Tzedek is Inyan Shalom Aleichem Sha'omrim. What is the Inyan of Shalom Aleichem that we say? And throughout the Maimer, it says many times Sha'omrim, that we say, that we say, that we say. I don't think it's absolute evidence, because maybe Sha'omrim that the Welt says. But I think a reasonable argument can be made from that, at least as a possibility that here too there was kufis. And ubefrat that we see by Machnisei Rachamim that there were kufis. Where earlier he suggested not saying, and then later we know before we have evidence that he did say. I don't think it's a stretch to say that earlier he said Shalom Aleichem, and that later he did not say Shalom Aleichem according to the Eidos of Reb Chaim Shneur Zalman, and that later he went on to change. Now, all of this has been what? Now we've reached the home stretch. All of this has been what? I've showed you, starting from Rebbe Lazar of Worms, and another few Mekoides, all trying to explain how Machnisei Rachamim does not contradict the Yerushalmi. And we saw numerous perspectives on why it does not contradict the Yerushalmi. The last one of which is that the Yerushalmi is only forbidding if you're treating the Malach as a god. If you're not treating the Malach as a god, but only is doing his shlichus, no problem, right? That was the last one. We saw others. So for example, only Bisman Abayis. If it's only then the Yerushalmi, man, what else did we see? That if it's tzivoy, it's okay. We saw that as well. So these are 4 different explanations of why the Yerushalmi doesn't apply. However, there's a 5th one, and I'd like to suggest that if you asked the Frierdiker Rebbe or the Rebbe Rashab and the Rebbe Marash, they would tell you a 5th explanation. Where am I getting this 5th explanation? So this starts from the Panim. And that is like this. We have the Nusach of the Panim of the Rebbeim. The Rebbe and the Shimis wrote down the Nusach of the Pan of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Pan that was used after the previous Rebbe had passed away. So in other words, the Pan the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote that he used in Rostov, or the Pan that the Rebbe Rashab used for Lubavitch. We have these Panim. The Frierdiker Rebbe's pan, how do we have? Because the Rebbe wrote it in his Shemis. The Rebbe Rashab's pan, how do we have? Because he gave it, during World War I, he gave it to Bachrim, who were in Lubavitch, to read it for him at the oil, and they copied down the Lashon. Falakan copied down the Lashon, and put it in Shmos V'Zipurim. The Frierdiker Rebbe also writes that he went to the Shamish of the Beis HaKvaris, and he asked him does he have any panim from his Zayda, the Rebbe Maharash, and he said, yeah, and he gave him a pan from the Rebbe Maharash. This was written, this pan, it only surfaced recently. It's printed in Sefer Mamor and Tofrei Samach Gimel in the back. This pan was written when Rebbe Stern Sora was pregnant with the Frierdiker Rebbe. There were complications in pregnancy. So the Rebbe Maharash, who was still alive, wrote a pan to the oil to be read at the oil. And the nusach of all these panim, Frierdiker Rebbe, Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Maharash, there's some differences between them. But what's the nusach goes like this. Okay, awaken immense mercy. From the source of Rachamim, from the source of true chesed. Okay. Al derech, similar to Machnisei Rachamim, the piyut of Machnisei Rachamim, K'moshe Kasuv b'tshuvas Maharib Zal, which is addressed in tshuva, in the tshuva of Maharib, and let this Rachamim be avuri b'nai, for me, his son. This is the nusach that the Frierdiker Rebbe was writing. So there's two differences from the way it's written today and the way panim are written today and the way it's here. Number one, where is the Rachamim from? Comes from Rachamim v'achsadim ha'amitim. Okay, interesting. The Rebbe said in Tafshin Yud, we shouldn't say this. What's in the Negea for you to tell the Rebbe where he should go talk? He knows where to talk. Just say on a later Rachamim, he'll figure out where he should daven. Okay, that's change number one. The Rebbe also said we should take out this K'moshe Kasuv b'tshuvas Maharib Zal al derech Machnisei Rachamim. We should take that out as well. The Rebbe said this in the Sikha and Tafshin Yud, and so Chassidim took it out even though there was knowledge, because everyone knew about this pan from the Rebbe Rashab. So even though there was knowledge about it, he said we should stop doing it, which is why we stopped doing it. There is a pan extant from the Maharil. The Maharil is the Rebbe Maharash's older brother. And in this pan from the Maharil, Yudaleb, this pan from the Maharil, the second oldest son of the Tzemach Tzedek, we have one pan from him. It does not have this Maramokim over there. It does not have this Maramokim. What is this Maramokim? Who's the Maharib? What is going on over here? The Maharib is Rabbi Yisrael Bruno. Rabbi Yisrael Bruno lived in the 1400s in Germany. And he has tshuvas. And he has a tiny tshuva that is 3 lines long that says as follows. Let's read it inside. When we say, no mida nechoina, that's the piyut that we say on Erev Rosh Hashanah. V'chein midas rachamim, I'm not sure what that is. Machnisei Rachamim, that's the piyut that we say at the end of each slichus. And malachei rachamim, that's the piyut that we read this morning in Gimel Slichus. So all these things, writing in the 1400s, Rabbi Yisrael of Bruno writes, Einoi elo derech shiflus va'avdus. It is only Einoi elo. It's a negation here. It is only derech shiflus va'avdus. It is only as a way of submissiveness and servitude. What's going on over here? He explains. Shamedaber bifnei hamelech. You're speaking in front of the king. He goes out of his way to say you're speaking in front of the king. Li yoyatzav, to his council. Lidaber lamelech, asking that they speak to the king. Why? Why are you, if you're in front of the king, why are you asking the council to speak to the king? Because shiflos va'avdos. Because you feel submissive. Because you feel servitude. Or as he continues to say, because you feel ashamed, you feel embarrassed to get closer to the king. If this is what these tefillas are about, this is in no way intermediation. In other words, Mari Bruno is aware of the Rambam, is aware of this language of emtsoi, and is responding to it. And what is he saying as follows? If I may say, he's aware of the Yerushalmi as well. And he's responding to it. What's the Yerushalmi's problem? The Yerushalmi's problem is, and when your perspective is, I can't get into the palace of the king. I'm an outsider. I have no shaykhs in the Eibishter. I'm such a low madrega. Oh, so you know what? I'll speak to the middlemen. They'll bring my tefillah in. Zok to Yerushalmi, no, that's a terrible perspective. You're not allowed to have that perspective. Even though we saw some others who said that sometimes you're allowed to have that perspective. No, you're not allowed to have that perspective. You are, says Mari Bruno, in front of the king. You are in the palace. You made it in already. You're talking to him. Never then, you don't want to talk to him directly. Why? Because you feel bittul in the language of Chassidus. You feel bittul because you feel humble, so therefore you can't get the word. How many times has happened? Someone tells you, there was an overwhelming experience and I couldn't speak. So that's what this is. A Jew standing before God, it could be such an overwhelming experience he can't speak. So what does he do? He turns to someone else and asks that someone else, you'll speak to the king for me. So that's not an emtsoi. What does an intermediary mean? Intermediary means you, A, cannot connect to C. The only way A could get to C is if B is there. But that's not the case here. There's no emtsoi here because I'm right in front of the king. And theoretically, I could talk to him if I wanted to. Never then, I feel so much shame that so that I'm not doing it. That's not an emtsoi at all. This is Marie Bruno's approach. It's a whole different way of thinking about this, and it's very empowering, and it's a very beautiful answer. Okay, now, so let's think about this. Starting from the Reb Marash, Chassidim they wrote this in the Panim. In other words, why is it mutter for me to ask a tzaddik who has passed away to daven for me? L'choyre, maybe it's a shaila if it's mutter or not. You should know the heter for it is Tshuvas Mari Bruna. They chose this. Even though there are many other sources that discuss it, they chose this. Because this is a beautiful explanation. This is saying, I know I have a direct link. Of course we know we have an Neshama. Of course we know we connect to the Eivishter directly. But, Afal B'Kain, I'm still asking that you daven for me also. So they started writing this into the Panim. Now the Rebbe came along in 1950 and said, why do we need to write the source in the Pan? Take it out. So he took it out. But still, what do you see from here? If this was the justification that the Rebbeim used for asking a tzaddik to daven, well, what is the source text talking about? It's talking about Machnisei Rachamim. So obviously, they appreciated and liked this answer for why Machnisei Rachamim is acceptable. So therefore, I say, the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashab, and the Fidik Rebbe, if you ask them why Machnisei Rachamim is acceptable, they'll tell you, this is the reason. Mahari Bruno, he's the Maharib. He's the one. This is the explanation for why Machnisei Rachamim is acceptable. So why doesn't the Tzemach Tzedek bring him? He lived in the 1400s. So I'll tell you something interesting. The Tzemach Tzedek in his Chuvas brings Marie Bruno, Yisrael of Bruno, many times. Every single time, it's an indirect quotation. Never once does he say, that I found, never once does he say, as it says in Chuvas Marib. He says, as we see in so-and-so, quoting Marib, again and again and again and again. In other words, he didn't have it. Why didn't he have it? The first print of the Chuvas Marib Bruno was in 1798 in Salonika. Okay, 1798 in Salonika, the Tzemach Tzedek was still alive for another 28 years. But Salonika is Salonika. That's far from where the Tzemach Tzedek is, and more years. Tzemach Tzedek was alive more, 60 something years into this. And Afal B'Kain, he never quotes it because Salonika, two things. First of all, it's far. Second of all, I just happened to come across this. That this printing of the Shuvas Marie Bruno and the Hakdama to the new edition, they write that at the printer shop, after the printing, there was a fire and very few copies survived. They say, Adayom, there's very few copies of this. So it makes so much sense that the Tzemach Tzedek didn't have it. When was the second printing of this? The second printing was in Germany in 1860. That is 6 years before the Tzemach Tzedek passed away. So B'meila, when he wrote all those Chuvas, he didn't have it. And when he did the Maimer in Eira Torah in 1830, he didn't have Marie Bruno. And that's why the Maril, the oldest son of the Tzemach Tzedek, in his Pan, he doesn't write Kimavor B'Tshuvas Marib. He passed away a few years after the Tzemach Tzedek. He passed away in the 1860s also. So he also didn't see this tshuva. It was only later that this tshuva surface came around, and it was embraced by the Rebbe Marash, it was embraced by the Rebbe Rashab, and it was embraced by the Fidik Rebbe. And that's why I say, although we have these other explanations, you have the Yavit saying, it's not a problem, right? We just saw and the Eira Torah seems to be reflecting that. The Tzemach Tzedek seems to be saying, it's not a problem. As long as you know as God is boss, it's not a problem. Or we saw the other explanations. It's a tzivui, it's a command, or Bisman HaGolus is different to whatever it is. All of those explanations are great, but Marie Bruno's explanation, that seems to be the best explanation. It seems to be the one that was embraced by the Rebbeim after the Tzemach Tzedek. So at the end of the story, we end up saying these passages. There are very few of them that we say. Few in Tzlichis, Shalom Aleichem. There's maybe a handful of prayers throughout the year that we say like this. And I think that is a good reminder. These types of prayers are a good reminder for two things. Number one, on the one hand, it reminds us how close we are. And on the other hand, it reminds us how far we are. how close we are. The justification for saying these prayers is only with the mindset that your mom is standing in front of Melech HaKadosh Baruch Hu yourself. That's the whole justification. Look how close you are. But at the end of the day, look how far you are in the sense of, I'm fart ashamed. I fart know that I could be much better. I could be connected to the Eibusher better. I know that there's some action and inaction where it wasn't so good. And that's why I feel distant in a way that I don't want to speak to the Eibusher and I'm speaking to them. So there's a certain tension within this prayer, both the closeness to the Eibusher and as well as the distance that's generated by the things that we do. And I think that that's a healthy tension for a person to have when they're going into Yamim Noraim and they're going into Tefillah in general. And now, Aksiv Aksiv Taiva, Shana Taiva Mesuka.